with us on this. Thank you. This will be recorded. And thank you for spending time with us on this wonderful Wednesday. Safety, it's important that we're chiming in and checking in on it on a monthly basis. And so in normal safety forum fashion, we've got a nice group today that probably can get into some good discussions on near misses. So let's go through our near misses roundtable. Normally for the group that doesn't normally attend, or for the group that doesn't normally attend, we would every forum just discuss what we've noticed out there in our job sites when we're looking around, or when we're out doing our normal thing and we notice things that we better go ahead and take care of, or else there could be a pretty big safety issue, right? So near misses, what was recognized out there that was able to get handled proactively versus dealing with it reactively. So open it up to the group. Anybody got anything that you want to discuss that maybe we need to get the attention of the other parties and contractors and partners in the room?
The one thing we had was after that huge snowstorm, not this last one, the one before, we were working on that Friday, and my service team went up to a house and they're going to do they had a project we had planned for a long time. They pulled up to the house and they hadn't shoveled or any of that, and there's 2 feet of snow. So instead of doing the job, I just rescheduled it and left and said, sorry, we can't. Like we couldn't even, like they had like 2 feet. We couldn't even get into the driveway or find a path to like get to the house. So we just pulled off. My service manager probably saved something happening. So
Good point. Yeah, that's a really, really good point, Joe. And so what did you told your customer then that you would need a clear pathway to the work?
yeah, tell them we need a clear pathway. I mean, obviously it costs us. It definitely costs money to have to leave, go somewhere else. But I was like, until you have a clear pathway, we can't do any work at your house. And he understood and he got it clear. We did the job last week, but it was one of those where it's like, well, it's kind of a wasted day. It wasn't great travel anyways, but better than better than somebody slipping on that and getting
Or
hurt.
paying somebody to shovel a walk, right? Your electricians, that's a lot of money to pay for somebody to shovel the walk and to clear a pathway to get to your work. You know what I mean? So yeah.
It's heavy snow too, so I mean, you really don't want, that's the other thing, is you don't want your guys to even do that and shovel, because then somebody's shoveling and they hurt their back because they're trying to help them and they're doing all that. So there was a twofold thing. I think my safety manager did a really good job there by identifying that he wasn't comfortable doing it because he didn't want to get hurt. So
Sure, yeah.
it was a
Sometimes safety happens because of the kindness of our heart, right? Yeah, I'll do that real quick, and the next thing you know, you're either hurting yourself or there's a risk of damaging equipment, right? And things like that. They get somebody out there chipping out on concrete or clearing a pathway, right? And they throw snow or something where it shouldn't have gone. And just opens up a whole world, right, of scenarios, right? Don't feed the bear, right? We're not going to do it, so thank you, Joe, for sharing that. And that's a really good point. That's something that probably a lot of contractors deal with, right? When it comes to, hey, I have to get to this spot. My people aren't paid movers, we need to, not just for snow, right? If there's a bunch of, so we could lift something wrong and hurt their back, something like that, if there's a bunch of things in the way. So yeah, make sure that's when you're arranging your work, you've got a good access, right? And a good working space. There's actually a code, when it comes to that kind of stuff. So
yeah, that's one thing that we've really actually started hitting on pretty good lately, is just like, if we're gonna go into somebody's house and we're gonna add a bunch of lights and we're gonna redo a bunch of stuff, like making sure that they're clearing the path so we can actually work in there. 'Cause I feel like we've always just tried to go above and beyond and just help people out, but it's like, hey, our job's not to move your table and your couch and all
if you
that.
drop that table or couch or whatever, right, you're
Like,
liable for it.
exactly. So it's just like all those, and it's just eliminate other ergonomic issues and all that from the guys that already have enough of that. So just to eliminate the extra. So
Very awesome. Thanks for pointing that out, Joe. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything that has come to light that we could share with the group? Anything you've seen, you heard? You're making it real easy on this Wednesday morning. You really are. Okay, so and if anything comes up amongst the group, something you think out of, here in a moment, we're going to get to our subject, but maybe at the end of it all, if you want to bring it up, we'll get to it. Okay, so wanted to share with the group real fast the remaining calendar for 2024. And all of these subjects or all of these objectives are subject to change, but I just always want to make sure that we're aware of what's coming. So right now we're doing the share to temp worker right here in March. Next month, April 24th, we'll be doing arc flash and a overview of NFPA 70E. In May, we're going to do, probably doing a number of things, but the focus of May will be for the OSHA stand down for fall prevention. All right, it's a big national initiative that OSHA puts through, and we'll probably bring OSHA in for that. The very following month in June, we're going to start prepping for the heat. We'll probably bring OSHA in again to cover OSHA heat, okay, and what contractors need to do to ensure shade, hydration, right? When the weather starts getting warm. In July, we are going to do our facility tour. Okay, we haven't really picked where we want to go. We haven't really dug into that location yet. But if anybody has any ideas or knows any projects that are going on, we've done things from going to job sites from ground up, right? Skyrise job sites to evaluate what it's looked like to have to work on that in that environment. We've gone to, we can go do Empower Field, right? And really look at their infrastructure and how they do it. We've done Union Station, we've done the airport. So if you guys have any really fun ideas of what we can go and take a look at when it comes to the ins and outs of large scale safety, right? And what needs to be done and what administrative controls need to be put into place to kind of orchestrate that type of dance, if you will, on a job site when it comes to safety in a day. So really cool stuff when you start getting into really large scale job sites on how they are focusing on safety, right? And so let me know. That's July. We're going to get into confined space in August, which we might bring OSHA in again. The good thing about Meredith Post, which we all got a chance to meet in January when we did our OSHA update, she wants to be involved with us. She wants to be the person to present, right, the information, because there's not any grapevining, right? You're hearing it directly from OSHA. So really good stuff. They're not going to be doing any audits on you. It's going to be just good conversation and, preparedness. So confined space, August. In September, that's the national stand down for suicide prevention and mental health. So we will be covering that topic. In October, we're going to go over temporary power and lighting for the job site. We're going to do our 2025 scheduling in November. Normally, we don't have a November meeting, but we felt that would be a good time. It's a smaller group. We don't need everybody to schedule 2025. Choose a handful of topics. So we'll do that on November 20th. And then in December, it's a little earlier in the month, December 11th, we're going to do winter driving for fleet management for the groups to ensure that we understand how to tie things down, make sure vehicles are in good repaired, good driving habits, right, and road conditions. So that is the calendar for the remaining 2024. Does anybody have any questions on that or anything that we're missing as far as providing value to y'all as our partners, right, when it comes to safety? Is there anything that we need to jump into? All pretty good topics. Awesome. Well, we're trying to hear you. So these were put on by, y'all's feedback. So thank you so much. Which leads us into today's topic. Okay, great topic on the borrowed or temp worker. A lot of contractors are out there and sometimes needing a new workforce, right? Or sometimes they have workforce that I've got great people, I don't have as much work right now, so maybe we lend them out to other contractors, right? Like over at IEC Rocky Mountain, we have a borrowed worker program. And so it's important when the whole orchestra of moving manpower around in workforce from either workforce centers, right, or temp agencies, to labor agencies, to contractor, there's got to be some really good a really good outline and plan when it comes to, what's the scope of the work of that job. What are the JSAs, right? When it comes to the type of work to be done, what tools and equipment are being done, what's the environment of which you're working in? And who is responsible for, ensuring that that employee or that temp worker has what they need for success and safety, right? When it comes to moving around. So we've got some awesome subject matter experts to join us in this conversation today. We've got Alan and Herb with Network Insurance, who's going to really kind of dive into the ins and outs and administrative controls and policies, procedures, maybe that we need to take or that y'all need to take a look at to ensure that that's a smooth process and not just what we do when we onboard, but let's say there is an accident, right? When it comes to some borrowed work or temp work, what needs to be done at that point and what check boxes need to, need to be covered. So, Alan, Herb, thank you so much for your time this morning, and we really appreciate your expertise and helping lead the conversation. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it on over to y'all.
Terrific. Yeah, thanks for having us this morning. And Paul said to be prepared for a 45-minute presentation. I said it probably won't go that long unless other people want to talk. So unless you guys are a chatty bunch this Wednesday morning, hopefully it won't be too much death by PowerPoint. So
Ask a lot of questions. Yeah, ask a lot.
yeah,
It's an important subject, right?
definitely. And Paul, I could sometimes get rolling while I'm talking. So if there's any questions in the chat, let me know. It's sometimes hard to talk and watch that at the same time. So, but everybody feel free to pipe in if you have any notes, questions, things you want to talk about. So yeah, thanks for having us in. And, we also wanted to show you some of the insurance perspectives when it comes to borrowed and temporary employees. So for some of you, this may not be directly applicable. You may not be in charge of the workers' comp policy or the general liability policies, but hopefully we can give you some good things. That way, you know what's going on in the back end, and maybe you can go talk to the people that do influence those policies as well. So first thing, before you get an insurance involved, the best way to keep us out of your lives is to make sure and prevent the injury, right? And there's a lot of different aspects to temporary and borrowed workers that you have to think about when bringing them on site, right? It's a little tricky because you're in an agreement with a temporary agency, and there's a lot of moving parts when you're borrowing an employee from another company as well. And one of the biggest parts of that is, making sure that they have the right PPE and the appropriate gear. A lot of times employees will like to use their own gear. But if you're bringing one of these employees on site, it's behoove you to inspect that gear. Make sure it's appropriate. Make sure you're not going to create this liability for yourself. I worked for a mining company right out of college, and the amount of times we harped on hard hats, making sure that you're replacing them every so often, doing the scrunch tests, make sure they're doing good. Small things like that make a big difference in preventing injury. When you're also in a contract with these different, potentially a staffing agency or these other companies, and you have an agreement, sometimes they say they're going to provide the gear, sometimes they put it on you. So make sure you understand what's going to be brought on site and how it is. And the flip side to that is if you're sending your employee to another company, right, you want to make sure they're being provided the right gear. You need to be able to have that open dialogue with your employee and that they feel safe enough coming back to you and saying, hey man, I don't feel like this company I'm working for, their gear's worn out. I feel like there's a hazard there. Something can go on. And when we're talking safety, that honest communication can sometimes be the hardest part. right? I mean, it's so difficult sometimes getting employees to trust you enough to tell you about near misses, first of all. But also, if you're going out and working, they know that you're working for their buddy. It's tough for them to come back and say, "Hey, I don't think your buddy's the safest guy to be working for." So
And for the group, real fast, just wanted to let you know, we do have in the audience today, we have Garrett Taylor, who is a subject matter expert on, right, the temp worker, right, owner and operator of Taylor, is it Staffing? Is that what it is, Garrett?
Well, Taylor Trades.
Taylor Trades. And so he can add a different perspective to those contractors out there because he's really tied into that. So I just wanted to point Garrett out in the audience today so that if there was any questions, maybe Garrett, you could chime in on the worker the new workforce thing. So
Sounds good.
yeah, and thank you, Garrett. We also we asked Garrett to provide a sample contract too, just so we could kind of see what types of contracts are out there between staffing agencies and other electrical companies. So appreciate your help with that as well. But as you all know, as insurance agents, we also like it when there's a safety plan in place, right? And not only that, but an active safety plan, not just something you type up, submit to your insurance agent and hope that they think you're good enough and you'll get a good premium, right? Like you actually want to be actively involved in that training program. There's you could talk cost containment, ways to save some money on your workers' comp, and that requires actually documenting safety meetings and having those periodically. So, there's an important part of not just having something, but actively maintaining it and updating it. It's also important when you're bringing in these employees to make them aware of the injury protocol, who they're supposed to talk to, who they're to report to. They're not familiar with everybody on site. So just giving them that refresher as well. And then, like Paul talked about, there's your high level safety plan. And then there's the JSAs, the site and job specific training. Every place you go has something just a little different, little unique. So there's kind of the common hazards that you're typically aware of, but there can be something unique to the site. A couple months ago, one of my close friends, her son-in-law works construction, and he took off about a week for paternity leave. And when he came back on the site, and again, I'm not sure the exact details. I didn't really want to ask whose fault it was, and it's her son. But one way or another, things were changing. He fell into a window well and broke both of his legs. So it's an awful situation. And, it's one of those things, not just temporary and borrowed workers, but, even workers that have been off the site for a little bit sometimes can use that refresher. So it's good to always keep that in mind and keep safety at the forefront. And even refresh people that have been working there for a little while. The temporary and borrowed workers can be a good reminder to refresh those workers as well. Because sometimes, as you know, overconfidence can be pretty deadly when it comes to safety. And if you think you know something about the job site that isn't actually there, it can lead to a lot of bad situations. So, any comments you guys have? You guys are the safety professionals, so you guys might have a little bit more to add on this topic.
yeah, you raised a good point, where if you do have somebody that has been just away from the job site for a certain amount of time, right? They get back onto the job site and just like, when we become, the experts in our industry is when it comes to electrical, there's a sense of complacency that can happen, right? You're assuming that everything is all good. You're expecting to pick up right off where you left off on the job, right? And that job site has now changed. It's no longer where it was a week or two ago when you were last on that job site. So being familiar with all of those different changes, right, and safety hazards that have occurred since the last time you were on that project, that's a really good point. It's something that proactively, right, when you have somebody who's been off for a while, hey, have them go walk that site real fast, right? Get with that general contractor to see what the schedule progression has been like, you know, and really get up to speed. That's a really good point. Proactively, you can do that, and I'm sure that'll help mitigate some of these safety issues just by doing that. So good point. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, and that's where your toolbox talk can, your morning just, get everybody's gauge of where they're at can be pretty important, and upcoming work tasks as well. So, the other way to prevent injury is, when you're typically getting into these situations where you're borrowing employees, making sure the employee is adequate to the task that's required, right? If you're asking for an apprentice level task and you're not getting an apprentice, you're getting more of say you want a journeyman, or you're way overqualified, being able to come back to the staffing agency and say, hey, I need somebody with way more experience for this task. I don't want them to hurt themselves because they don't know what they fully need to be doing, and they're, again, overconfident or complacent. So again, these are difficult conversations sometimes to have, especially when it comes to borrowed employees, because you're working between businesses who have good working relationships. But feeling confident enough to be able to go back to them and say, hey, man, your guy's just not cutting it. We need somebody with a little bit more experience to be able to step into this. That's going to prevent injury again, right? So that can sometimes be a difficult conversation to have, but it's important for you on your work site to be in charge of safety. And so that's why it's important to be thinking of these things as well. So with that, we'll move into a little bit more of the back end insurance side of things. And we'll start out by talking about borrowed employees. So there's kind of, two sides to this coin. I'm sure some of you have used borrowed employees or loaned out borrowed employees. So it's really important, as with anything, right, that when you have an agreement between two people, if there's the potential for lawyers and insurance agents to get involved, come to an agreement and put that agreement in writing, right? I've, outside the construction world, the worst thing that can happen is, when you loan money to a buddy and he never pays you back, and then you gotta get involved with stuff like that. That's just not a situation you want to get. So just put that agreement in writing. This, of course, is where I'll recommend you get your legal counsel involved. Look at that agreement, make sure they agree with it, and then also get your insurance broker involved. We try and look at your policies to look about where your risk is and to make sure you're fully covering everything that you should. So throw that agreement by your legal counsel, by your insurance broker, make sure everything's covered. Because the worst thing that can happen is, one, you get in a situation where you get companies pointing fingers of who's liable, who's going to pay for when an employee gets injured, or who's going to pay when damages occurred due to that employee. So save yourself some nightmare and go ahead and do that. So the question then also becomes, whose workers' comp is responsible for injuries if you have a borrowed employee on site and they get injured? There's kind of a couple questions you can use. Again, just disclaimer, this is just general advice for typical policies. This may not be applicable to yours, so don't take it as such. But typically you kind of ask yourself three questions. One, as long as the employee's agreed to go work for the other person, that's a good thing, right? Whose work are they performing for, and who's directing the work? And then who's benefiting from that work that's produced? So typically it's the company borrowing the employee answers yes to all those questions. Therefore, they're the implicit employer, and their workers' comp will typically cover injuries to that worker. Again, barring any agreement you make outside the norm, but normally when you're talking about borrowed employees, that's the case. It's going to be the person borrowing the employee is going to be responsible for their work comp. The other thing you need to be asking is whose general liability policy is responsible for damages and injury. Again, when you're talking borrowed employees, typically It's going to be whoever's using the employees is going to be their policy will cover for that. An important thing to do though is when you're sending employees out or even receiving them, getting certificates of insurance. You know, again, the last thing you want to do is put the employee who's injured in this situation of they're sitting in the hospital, they're accruing all these medical bills, and there's finger pointing of employers going on in the background. So the last thing you want to do is be borrowing an employee from an employer that doesn't have workers' comp. Not typical. You know, workers' comp is required in Colorado, so it should be something everyone has. But getting that certificate of insurance is further proof that they actually have a policy in effect, and you know that that employee is covered. Kind of a trickier one, waivers of subrogation. So this is one where if you're giving a waiver of subrogation, you're accepting all the risk. So be careful about when waivers of subrogation are requested or asked for. Typically you see this kind of between like prime and subcontractors, they ask for it. But again, it's important to talk to your insurance broker. Some policies don't really like this. You know, insurance companies, when they pay a claim, they like to be made whole too. So if there's negligence by that borrowed employee, sometimes, you know, the insurance companies may want to go and try and make themselves whole from that employee's company. So waivers of subrogation are kind of an important point. They're a little tricky. So again, just remember when you're giving away a waiver of subrogation, you're accepting all of the risk, and your insurance company is no longer allowed to go after, or typically they're no longer allowed to go after the third party. So when it comes to payroll and workers' comp though, since your policy is in charge or will come into effect over that borrowed employee, sometimes how you pay the borrowed workers gets a little tricky too, right? Sometimes you're paying them directly, so that's great. It's on your payroll. You don't have to worry about it. Sometimes you pay the company and then the company pays the borrowed employee that you have. So the reason that gets a little tricky is because the way workers' comp is typically rated is based on your payroll. So what you need to do is, if you're borrowing an employee and you're paying the company for their services, you need to track that additional payroll onto your work comp and your general liability audits and add it to your workers' comp. And then the borrowing company or the borrowee, I guess I don't know. The loaning company, there we go. Thanks for the word. The loaning company needs to deduct that employee's expenses from their workers' comp. Otherwise, you're kind of getting double counted for workers' comp. Not the worst thing in the world, but hey, it can save you guys a penny or two by deducting it as well. So any questions about borrowed employees? Any comments? We got a chatty group this morning. Yep, go ahead, Herb.
Yeah, you were talking about the waiver of subrogation. Which party should get the waiver of subrogation, the loaner employer or the borrowing employer?
The loaner employer would typically want the waiver of subrogation, right? That way the employer who's doing all the work accepts all that risk.
Right. So that's why they need to know upfront, who's going to be responsible. And then whichever one is responsible gives a waiver of subrogation to the other party, saying that they can't go back. Their insurance company, work comp carrier, can't go back and sue them. Just so you know, that's another reason why it's important to have the agreement in writing. For example, Pinnacle Assurance and many other companies, Pinnacle does this for free, other companies charge, but most contractors have this form on their work comp. It's called a blanket waiver of subrogation. So if the two parties, the loaner and the borrower, have a contract saying that a waiver of subrogation is required of the borrowing employer, their policy automatically covers it that way. They don't have to add an additional endorsement. They just put it in the contract and then it's covered. So that's the good news.
But, you know, again, you know, Pinnacle is one of the bigger ones. That's a typical policy. If you have a carrier that doesn't have that, it's important to Awesome. Well, hearing none, no other questions, we'll move on to temporary employees. Tell you what, my 6-month-old last night is talking a lot more than you guys, so he had me up a lot more. So, all right, temporary employees again. This one you're going to have a contracting agreement, right? The staffing agencies typically will require that. Look closely at that contracting agreement. Like we said, we got a sample contract from Garrett. We got another one from another contractor. They vary. They're different. Make sure and have your legal counsel look it over. And again, also have your insurance agent look it over. You know, we kind of liked Garrett's a little bit more. It specifically said they were going to provide certificates of insurance for both their workers' comp and their general liability. You know, some may not have that general liability piece. So make sure and look those contracts over and make sure you're in agreement for who's covered for what. Typically, when you're talking to a temporary employee, the staffing agency typically will cover the workers' comp. That's what we've seen that seems to be pretty typical. And that's because the federal government defines a temporary employee as having a joint employee. So there's shared control and supervision when it comes to that temporary employee. So you know how we talked about the workers' comp, the questions you need to ask before. The temporary worker is a little bit different. So that's why they can get away with covering the workers' comp directly themselves and you not having to worry about adding and deducting a payroll that way. But again, make sure that agreement says that to make sure you're adequately covered. The other, oh, I was skipping ahead. The other thing to look for in these agreements is indemnity agreements. You know, who's indemnified, who benefits from that statement, things to ask. Again, you have the waiver of subrogation. Again, who benefits from that? Important questions to be asking, especially on the insurance side, but also just in general, right? When you're accepting the risk, you want to make sure that's a risk you're comfortable accepting and that you know that you're accepting when you make these agreements. The last thing with temporary employees, you can add what's called an alternate employer endorsement on your policy. It may be there, it may not be there, but this is an important endorsement if the temporary staffing agency isn't covering workers' comp. You may need to talk to your broker, your carrier, and make sure your workers' comp coverage extends to a temporary employee. Because a lot of typical, yep, go ahead, Herb. I saw your finger go
Actually,
up.
what the alternate employer endorsement does is that it's added to the policy of the temp agency. And what it does is it names the person who's using their services or the company that's using their services. What it does is it names that company as an alternate employer on the policy of the temporary agency. So therefore, what it's doing is if a temp worker is injured on another company's job site, the workers' compensation policy is not only primary for that employee, but it also extends coverage should someone sue the customer of the temp agency, it picks that up. And let me ask, Garrett, have you run into this situation? Does anybody ask for an alternate employer endorsement from you?
Yeah, some of the bigger general contractors and stuff like that. Now, it's probably important to note I don't work just in Denver, so I've seen a lot across the country and
Yeah.
things like that. So yeah, typically from that side of it,
Okay.
I've seen that a little bit, but not a ton is what I'd say in
Not
the
a ton.
subcontractor
I
agreements.
suspect you will be seeing it more in the future
I'm
because,
sure.
yeah, what this does, it adds another layer of protection for the employer who is actually hiring a temp employee. And we have copies of that form if anybody would like it. Just send an email to Alan or myself, and we can get you a copy of how that, it's information on how the form works, as well as a copy of the endorsement. Thanks, Alan.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate it. You know, one of the important parts when you're talking insurance is there's typically this part of the policy that's called definitions, right? And who counts as an insured on your general liability policy is very important. A lot of typical policies specifically exclude the temporary worker. They say they are not covered as insureds on your policy, and that's very important for the temporary employee staffing agency, right? Making sure you have general liability coverage to protect that employee should the employee be sued, not the company, right? You want to provide defense costs for them. So again, this is where the contract and agreement come into play, and making sure that general liabilities on both sides are providing the coverage they need to for you know, a little bit of a tricky situation when you're talking about, you know, multiple employers, multiple policies coordinating with each other. Again, this is also where we'll harp again on get a certificate of insurance from the temporary staffing agency. And, you know, Garrett, the staffing agency should probably ask for certificates of insurance too when on the parts of the policy that you are concerned with to make sure, again, your worker is protected as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on all that. Just, I think the most important part on this entire slide is contracts vary, right? I mean, people don't realize that, all staffing companies, all temporary workers, all, subcontractors, all GCs, they don't operate the same way. And, you start getting legal involved on certain things and you'll really see how things vary from lawyer to lawyer, to be completely honest with you. And I've always told our partners, is, hey, as long as we communicate and we're transparent about things, we have agreement that we both understand moving forward before anything happens, then we're all in a good spot. And if that's not the case, then, I'll be honest, I've had to deny some people in the past 6 months just simply because, just put them out there. I need the help. And we have nothing in place yet. It's like, no, we're not going to go down this road because that's exposure for both sides that nobody should be willing to take on. So very good points here.
One of the reasons Alan mentioned that the definitions are important, the definition of employee on the general liability policy includes a borrowed worker, which is really great, but it does not include, it specifically states that it does not include temporary worker. So what happens here is that if the temporary worker drops a hammer or a light fixture on somebody's head, and the employer, the temporary employer in this case, gets sued, the employer himself has, or the employing company has general liability coverage for their liability. But if the worker also is sued, that general liability policy for the temp agency's customer will not address the defense legal costs for that temporary worker. That would go back against the policy of the temporary company. So that's one reason you want to make sure they have general liability, because the temporary worker himself or herself would be protected by the policy of the temporary agency. Thanks, Garrett.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, as you can see, it gets pretty complicated and can get pretty convoluted. And, as from a safety perspective, one of the biggest things is, one, you want to prevent the injury, but then when injury does happen, the last thing you want is this employee sitting there injured, or whether he's an accident has happened and now he's stuck in this legal limbo. And one, his mind might be on his now legal troubles, right? And not focused on the thing at hand. And now he's becoming more of a safety liability because things are going on in the background that you could have prevented up front by addressing some of these insurance concerns. So, it's making people whole. I mean, that's the point of insurance, but also just protecting your workers too from this standpoint. Again, that's why you try and get brokers involved. You try and get risk professionals involved and lawyers involved at the beginning. That way you're not dealing with these ramifications on the back end. So kind of last point, just wanted to make it as well. You know, looking at Garrett's contract, there is kind of this trial period, right? Make sure and look at those contracts that his included kind of this trial period again for that employee to say, hey, this person's going to work out, this person's not going to work out. That's kind of your opportunity to judge kind of their risk behavior and whether they're going to be a safe individual or not. So again, within temporary employee, that's usually a little bit more defined in these contracts. So make sure you're looking out for that and make sure you take advantage of that as well. So some other potential issues, again, we won't talk about this too much. Just wanted to kind of highlight that they are out there. When you talk about your business auto policy, are the temporary and borrowed employees going to be driving your work vehicles? You know, if you have a fleet, that might be a little bit more of an option. If they are, you have to make sure and add them to your auto policy. And related with that, when they're added to your auto policy, you need to pull their MVRs and ask to see their MVRs. You know, Herb brought up this great analogy yesterday when we were talking about MVRs. There's a lot of driving behaviors, right? If they have a lot of tickets, they have a lot of accidents. He compared it kind of to playing slots at the slot machines, right? It's all these little actions, these little behaviors. And even though something big hasn't happened, you just keep putting the quarter in, and before long, you're going to hit, right? And especially as safety professionals, that's really important. That's why you do near misses, right? Because you want to catch these small things before they stack up and become something big. So when you're borrowing employees or you have temporary employees, you know, even something as little as looking at their MVRs to see if they engage in risky behaviors, they bring that driving record with them, those driving habits with them. So just understanding who you're bringing onto your work site, you know, you are responsible for the safety of the employees you're borrowing, or you're responsible for the safety of the employees that you're loaning out. So just be aware of that. Also, employment practices liability. These are pretty non-standard policies. So they vary widely policy to policy, but again, something to think about. You know, what if your employee is getting harassed by a temporary employee? What if a hostile environment's created by this temporary employee, or vice versa, right? You know, what if your permanent employees are harassing this temporary employee? Those are situations you don't want to be in. But if you are put in those situations, that's why you have employment practices liability. But again, it's very important to talk to your broker and make sure they're looking at the policy in great detail to make sure, one, you are covered and there's no coverage gaps. So I guess
I had one question. Let's say I work for Taylor Trades, right? And then Taylor sends me out to, you know, Jeff or Joe McGee's or McGee Electric, right? And Joe's gone through everything that he can go over with me, and I have all my documentation in line. And he puts me in charge of installing a $50,000 chandelier. Okay, and then I get up there and I do my thing, and for whatever reason, the stars didn't align for me, and I drop that $50,000 light fixture and I destroy it. It's not really a safety issue, but boy, I'm telling you, there's going to be some back and forth as far as, you know, who's responsible for that, right? Because it's not a direct cost to the contractor. It's for the project, right, and the building owner and the all of that stuff, right? And so it's a little bit on the side of safety, away from safety is what I mean. But so that's all probably covered under your general liability, I guess. How does that work? Does anybody have any ideas? It's not really safety, but what happens in that?
Hey, Paul.
Go ahead, Herb.
Yeah, that's a great question. And basically, if nobody is injured, You're only dealing with property damage, and provided there is a builder's risk policy, is probably the first place that you would go. So who owns the chandelier? You're installing it for somebody else, correct? So probably that the general contractor has the builder's risk policy. It may go against that, or he may have an installation floater that covers property on the job site, even if it hasn't been installed yet, or specifically if it hasn't been installed, that may cover it. But then again, the insurance company may go back against the general liability policy of the installer, which would be the one who hired the temp employee. So basically, you're the employer, correct? No, you're an employee. So basically, the general liability policy, probably from Garrett Taylor, from Tailored Trades, would actually respond to that after the property policy has paid it. There would be a waiver of subrogation back against your general liability policy, or the one who hired you. So it depends upon if you have a waiver of subrogation in place or not.
Gotcha.
So at first go after a property policy, then the property policy would look to be reimbursed. They would say, who's at fault here? We're going to make them pay us back. So
Garrett, do you see stuff like that?
I'm sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, Garrett, do you see stuff like that, you know, or have you experienced that? I know that I was very specific kind of on that scenario, but
Yes and
that's a good
no.
question, because it's not really safety related, but it is, you know, it's like, who is, you know, what do we do here, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, Herb's exactly right on kind of that situation. And, you know, I can also add too, I mean, most of our partners are not letting our people, you know, handle something like that, is what I'd say. It's going to be their own workers before they put a temporary worker on that task. The other side of that is, if that was the only, you know, person available to listen to that, the company is responsible for supervising and making sure everything goes right. But with that being said, I mean, we're going to work to come to a conclusion that makes sense for everybody involved as well. I mean, we're not in the business of, you know, charging or going after people's policies if it's not fit and things like that. It's more of, this is a partnership we entered in before, you know, we went out. We're working with humans. They're the most unpredictable, you know, thing in the world as far as what you may get on site, what you may not these days. And so, again, we would work towards a resolution to make sure that everybody kind of comes out a win-win-win in that situation. But I would hope that, you know, that's the last resort, is one of our workers is putting in a $50,000 chandelier. So.
Oh, but it does happen, right? I mean, it's unfortunate, and when that happens, it's kind of like, I mean, that's detrimental to that contractor, right? That's the
I'm
last
sorry,
thing
guys.
people-
It just occurred to me. And basically, it's an analogy. It's rather crude, but I'm going to share it anyway. So when you're out there on jobs and you guys are working, shit happens, right? So in this instance, you take care of the paperwork before the shit happens. You make sure that you've got everything lined up, so you have a better idea of who's responsible and where the coverage is coming from. Because shit happens, and if the paperwork is done first, it's easier to clean it up, okay?
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense, right? Cover
Don't ever
bases.
tell anybody I told you that.
That's a valid point, man. I was just gonna say that, is like, I would really not want to get in a situation where there's no paperwork and that happens. So, and I'll never put myself in that situation. I can promise you that.
Gotcha, right. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of pre-game check boxes, right? That's gonna go
Yeah.
into effect. So
Okay.
very cool, very cool. I just wanted to ask that question. I didn't want to
A
divert.
good
the
question.
conversation.
Yeah, good question. Just you know, basically, Paul, what happens is when something happens, everybody's pointing fingers, saying, "No, you're responsible. No, you're responsible. No, they're responsible." And so that's why you have to have a good agreement and upfront saying, you know, we're going to take care of this, we're going to take care of that. You're responsible because you're supervising the employee, they're working for you, et cetera. Just so you have a good idea upfront how to take care of things. And that's why you want to get your insurance agent involved, because they can talk to you about like alternate employer endorsements, waivers of subrogation, indemnify, defend, hold harmless wording. And we have to know how all that stuff works. And so we can give you good advice. Now, no, we're not an attorney, and you want to get the attorney involved when you're doing contracts, but we can tell you how the insurance policies work and how they respond to these situations. And it's good to know. I know insurance is a pain in the ass and it's boring and nobody likes it until you have a claim. When that shit happens, you're going to be so glad you had a good agent who's covering your butt. Yeah, it's a cover your ass thing. Sorry. I'm being crude again, but that's what it boils down to. So just make
For
sure you
sure.
have a
Yeah.
good agent and you know what's going on up front.
Yeah,
Yep.
first time I ever turned into a lawyer was, when on my personal auto policy, before I was even licensed as an insurance agent, something happened and all of a sudden I'm digging through that policy like nobody's business, trying to make sure I'm covered or they're at fault, and you're getting all this stuff. So like Herb said, doing the work up front is a bummer, especially when it comes to borrowed employees. It's really easy to just say, hey man, I'm low on work. Can I just borrow one of your guys? You told me you were low. And yeah, sure, here you go. You're just creating a lot of potential heartache for yourself if things don't go well.
Yeah, set a good foundation for your road, right, that you're gonna path on. Yeah, so yeah, all very good points, all very good points.
Yeah. Well, with that, that's kind of all I had for you guys today. This is, of course, the disclaimer saying, anything Herb and I said, take with a grain of salt, and it doesn't apply to your policy whatsoever. So we were talking typical scenarios. So make sure and talk to your broker about specific coverage information and potential needs. But feel free to reach out to Herb and I if you have any specific questions, or you want us to look at your policies too and get our advice. So we appreciate you guys having us on, and looks like I'm a couple minutes shy. So thanks for asking all the questions and making my presentation go a little longer.
Well, Alan and Herb and Network Insurance, right? Thank you so much. Mr. Garrett Taylor and Taylor Trades, thank you so much for helping out when it comes to today's forum and throwing back and forth information. Really appreciate it. Thank you for the group for joining us this morning, and thank you for Holly on the back end. She's going to compile kind of our business or today's meeting, right? She's going to send the recording out for y'all to review. I don't know if it's possible, Alan, can I get a copy of this presentation, so that I can maybe send it to the group to have kind of an outline of, if they're gonna start using, staffing or temp working, or borrowed workers, that they have at least some kind of a roadmap to look at?
Yeah, I don't see an issue with that. If you don't, Herb, I'll double check to make sure he's
No problem.
cool.
You just have
Yeah.
to cut out the part where I was talking about shit happening.
We'll put a disclaimer in there.
Okay, put a disclaimer for me. Thank you.
You betcha, you betcha. Is there any last questions from the group, or anything you want to discuss before we adjourn for this fine Wednesday? Don't make it too easy on us. All right, well, thank you again to the group. Thank you again to Network, and thank you again to Taylor Trades. So just such great information, right? And critical information, right? The ultimate goal about safety, just like we've discussed all day or all morning this morning, is, hey, the proactive approach, right? Let's analyze, let's visioneer, let's do some near miss type of stuff out there, because getting yourself attuned to that type of habit is really going to mitigate a lot of the safety issues we have out there. So appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you next month for NFPA 70E and Arc Flash. Have a great rest of your day. Be safe out there.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Alan, Herb, thanks again. Garrett, thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
Good to
guys.
see you.
Appreciate
Good
it.
to see
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Always.
You're most welcome.
Talk to you soon.
Anytime.
Thanks, Herb.